Hello everyone, I'm Caitlin Teeter, and on today's Teeter Tales, I'm going to be doing a review of Impossible Creatures by Katherine Rundell and illustrated by Mackenzie. When I read this, I actually thought that this was a standalone book, but when looking into it for doing this review, I found out that it is actually the first of a trilogy that will be published. I might hit on some light spoilers while doing this review, but I will include timestamps in the description for skipping past the spoilers and getting to specific sections. Let's get started. Impossible Creatures follows the story of two children, Christopher and Mal. Christopher lives in England with his father, while Mal is living in the Hidden Archipelago, a series of islands where magical creatures live alongside humans. The book begins with Christopher going to visit his grandfather in Scotland and discovering that creatures he thought only existed in myth actually exist in real life. Meanwhile, Mal's life is upended as she discovers the creatures in the archipelago are mysteriously dying, and a man shows up to murder her. The two children cross paths and then embark together on a journey through the archipelago to discover the mysterious reason why the creatures are dying. Rundell's writing is well executed throughout the book, but I found it to be lacking of any specific voice. At points, Rundell would have hints of humor or moments of tender insight, but for the most part, the book was lacking in its own writing identity. It seemed like it took at least half of the book for it to figure out exactly what it wanted to be and what sort of storytelling method it wanted to use. Rundell's writing is not bad by any means, in fact, it's well done, but there were only a few brief moments where the writing went beyond just basic prose stating what was happening. I don't normally include a section in my reviews where I talk about the artwork specifically of a book, but I feel the art of Impossible Creatures is deserving of special attention. Mackenzie's frequent illustrations throughout the book were actually my favorite part of reading this book. She manages to capture both humans and animals in stunning detail, and her work with light and dark creates some very striking images. Here's some examples from early on in the book that show off her beautiful and distinct illustration style. There's also a bestiary in the back of the book, illustrated by Virginia Allyn, who also drew the map for this book. Her work is really meticulous, and I really enjoyed comparing her style to Mackenzie's and seeing which creatures I preferred in which illustration style. Here's a page as an example of what her work looks like. Both of these artists are very skilled, and it was wonderful getting to see so much of their work sprinkled throughout this book. On the one hand, I quite enjoyed many of the side characters throughout this book, but on the other hand, I found the two main protagonists, Christopher and Mal, to be lacking in depth or personality. Christopher is a pretty standard young teen boy protagonist. His defining characteristic is that animals love him, but that doesn't really tell me much about him personally and didn't give me a reason to care about him. As such, I found him to be a pretty bland protagonist and didn't really care for his own personal story throughout the book. Mal had a very different problem from Christopher. She has a very clear personality, but after the beginning chapters of the book, she didn't really get much of a chance to show off her personality. The book is mostly focused on showing things from Christopher's perspective, so after those opening chapters, you don't get much of Mal's thoughts, and she kind of gets forced out of the action later in the book, so we don't get to see her spunky, daring side. In the end, that makes Mal feel like an interesting character with a lot of potential that was never tapped. I was very invested in most of the side characters in the book. Whether it was Nighthand, Ratwin, Irian, or Jack, I was entertained by their fun and distinct personalities. The side characters really stole the show for me and had very compelling arcs and lots of quirky fun habits. One of my biggest disappointments with this book was actually the villain. I'm gonna have some spoilers for this part as I talk about him. I was expecting a much more complex villain for Impossible Creatures, given the themes of corruption of humanity, are we good or bad for the world, our choices have severe consequences, all those themes that this book was grappling with, but the villain was essentially just bad with very little backstory, and he was bad for the sake of power and being bad. That made him feel like he was almost tagged on because not much of the book was even focused on him or what he was doing. All in all, Impossible Creatures has some excellent side characters, but suffers from underutilizing and underdeveloping its main protagonists and villain. Another issue I had with this book was that it seemed torn between what it was up until halfway through the story. In the first half of the book, it would bounce between being a more whimsical, lighthearted fantasy and a darker, more intense fantasy. I'm not opposed to books having both humor and darkness, as some of my favorite books actually have that balance at the core of their stories, but Impossible Creatures felt like it was torn between those two rather than balancing them. There's going to be some hinting at spoilers for this next section, so go ahead and skip that if you don't want. In the end, the story went the darker, more intense route, and while I'm not opposed to tragedy in younger fiction, as I love books like Where the Red Fern Grows or the Wingfeather Saga, I believe that it still needs to serve some sort of purpose for the overall narrative and feel earned in some way. Impossible Creatures had those moments of tragedy, but they felt out of place, since the narrative felt like it wanted to evoke wonder, but instead these heavier elements felt like they were removing magic from the world, and more like a tool for making the story mature. For the final thing that was my big complaint with this book was how long it took for the main plot to get started. Plot didn't really begin until halfway through the book. While it was interesting and there was lots of action to keep me engaged, the characters weren't given their focus for a big chunk of the narrative. This made early portions of the book feel pointless because even though it was interesting and there was a lot to keep me invested, I kept wondering what the point was. The pacing was also odd, as while it again had a lot of action and fun scenes, it would progress in uneven jumps. Sometimes you would go whole chapters without the plot really going anywhere, and then you'd have tons of important revelations dumped on you in a single chapter. Rundell managed to create a world which has a great structure for a fascinating and magical world, but her novel fails to dive into the intricacies of that world. Impossible Creatures does not really bring any new elements to the table of fantasy. The magical creatures are pretty standard for what you would expect and behave as you would expect them to. Unicorns have an ethereal beauty, manticores are vicious monsters, and griffins are cute and curious creatures. I love animal focused stories, especially ones that have fictional animals, but it almost felt like Rundell was trying to show off as many creatures as she could, which then led to none of them having much individual depth. There were some elements to her world building which I found really interesting, and I'm going to be going into some mild spoilers here. One specific plot point that was really interesting was the Immortal, a being who's been around since the beginning and is reborn upon death and remembers all of their past lives. This was a really unique element, but this and other unique elements Rundell didn't really introduce until much later into the book, so she didn't have enough time to do those ideas much justice. Again, Rundell's world building has the beginnings of a great fantasy world, but only scratches the surface of what makes her fantasy stand out from others. While Impossible Creatures is largely family friendly, I was surprised at a few of the more intense elements that popped up throughout the book. First, while it's not frequent, there are some fairly intense and disturbing moments of violence sprinkled throughout the book. For example, for a spoiler within the first few chapters of the book, it begins with an adult man attempting to murder 13-year-old Mao and slashing and killing her elderly aunt essentially in front of her. Adding to this, there are also wounds that are described in nauseating detail, such as describing the pus and peeling skin on a man's arm, or violent scenes that can be pretty frenetic, even involving kids punching and breaking each other's noses. One more shocking moment was when threatens another boy by saying, "I'll jump on your ribs next time until they break and stick into your lungs." Humans and creatures alike will meet violent ends, such as getting stabbed, slashed, eaten, or incinerated. There were also some mild profanities that popped up occasionally, but it wasn't even as frequent as, say, the Harry Potter books. Prominent plot point is that one character is an alcoholic, and while it is portrayed as negative, alcohol is discussed and consumed frequently in the book. There's some light romance in the book, but nothing that I think anyone would be concerned about. The magic in the book doesn't come across as spiritual, but seems more like a natural part of the world, with the exception of one thing, which will be some mild spoilers. The Immortal, which I mentioned earlier, also sometimes known as the Immortal Soul, is that figure who has been around since the beginning and is reborn as various species upon death and retains memories of all past lives. This is a very important plot point for the latter portion of the book, so there's no getting around it. I'll also point out, mostly for parents, that the book begins with Mal and Christopher explicitly disobeying orders from their authority figures, and rather than being punished, it's shown to be the right thing to do. I have very mixed feelings on Impossible Creatures. In some regards, I found the book very entertaining and interesting, but in others, it failed to live up to the most interesting characters and plot points it introduced. I did enjoy the book, but I don't really understand the stir that this book has caused. It seems like a fairly standard middle grade fantasy to me. Since I was under the impression that this was a standalone book, I had no idea that there were going to be two other books published in this series, so depending on what the next book is about, I may or may not continue this series. I did love the illustrations throughout the book by both Mackenzie and Allyn. I would say that it's worth picking up just to look at their beautiful artwork. Impossible Creatures was a quick read, but it sadly did not live up to the expectations I had for it. I hope this review was helpful, and thanks for watching. Bye!